The morning my world split open. The air smelled of ashes and rain. I remember standing barefoot in the damp earth outside the quarters, the horizon burning red with a sun that felt too heavy, too cruel to rise on such a day. My mother's body lay still inside, her breath gone, her hands folded neatly across her chest as if she had simply fallen asleep. But there was no warmth in her fingers anymore. She had been the root that held me to this earth, and now that root had been cut clean through. They came for mercy not an hour later. My little sister's face was pressed against the window as the wagon rolled away, her tiny hands beating against the wood while she screamed my name. She was only 9. I was old enough to know what it meant when they sold a child, but young enough that the sound of her voice carved holes into my chest that would never close. My throat was raw from shouting, my arms bloody from where I had clawed at the overseer's whip, but nothing stopped them. By sundown, Mercy was gone, swallowed by some road that led far away from me. I had always been told that God would carry us, that prayer and patience could ease the pain of bondage. My mother had taught me to listen to the rustle of leaves, to grind herbs into poultices that soothe broken skin and fevers. Nature has its kindness, she used to say. But as I knelt in the dirt that day, my mother buried behind the quarters and Mercy lost to the trade, I felt a hollowness in nature itself. The leaves whispered nothing. The wind gave no comfort. Even the soil beneath my nails seemed to mock me with silence. That night, when the others tried to hold me, I pushed them away. My body trembled not with grief, but with something far heavier, something that throbbed in my veins like heat. It was anger, yes, but not only anger. It was as though 1,000 voices had stirred awake beneath my ribs. Voices that did not belong to me. They spoke in the language of rustling cane, of thunder hidden in clouds, of oceans that had carried our blood across centuries. I had never heard them before, but they rose all at once, loud and insistent, filling my body until I thought my skin would split apart. I stumbled into the woods, seeking air, seeking silence, but the voices followed. The moonlight painted the trees in silver, and the ground was soft with pine needles that seemed to drink in my footsteps. My knees buckled, and I fell to the earth with my hands pressed hard against it. That was when I felt the first pulse. Not from the earth, but from within me. It was like the heartbeat of something ancient that had decided to live inside my chest. I gasped and clawed at the ground, but the heartbeat only grew louder, deeper, echoing through my bones until I realized it was not going to leave. In that moment, grief twisted into power. The world around me seemed to ripple. Shadows leaned toward me and the air bent as if it were listening. I felt my mother's face, her soft hand guiding mine through a field of herbs. But it was no gentle memory. It was sharper, clearer, laced with something like command. And then Mercy's scream pierced the memory, threading into it like a wire of fire. I pressed my palms into the dirt and whispered their names. But the whispers turned into something else. Words I had never learned. Words that felt older than the land beneath my knees. The night answered. A shiver ran through the ground, and the trees swayed though no wind stirred them. The air thickened, heavy as if the world was holding its breath. My body shook, my mouth dry, but I could not stop speaking. The strange words clawed their way out of me, low and harsh, until I felt a sudden heat burst in my chest and rush into my fingertips. The soil beneath my hands turned warm. The roots of the nearest tree seemed to pulse faintly, as if acknowledging my presence. I reeled back, terrified, and yet unable to deny the truth of it. Something had entered me, something vast and ancient, that had chosen me as its vessel. When I stumbled back toward the quarters, the others looked at me differently. Their eyes widened and some backed away. My skin was damp, my breath ragged, but I felt changed. My grief had not lessened. It had sharpened into a blade. Where before I had been Celeste the healer, Celeste the gentle hand with herbs, now I was something else entirely. The voices inside me hummed with restless energy, and I knew they would never leave. I did not sleep that night. I sat by the cold ashes of the fire, staring into the darkness, my heart drumming with that new foreign rhythm. Every flicker of shadow seemed to lean closer. Every creak of wood whispered like a secret. By dawn, when the first rays of sun bled across the horizon, I rose not as the woman I had been, but as someone the land itself seemed to recognize. The overseer crossed my path that morning, his boots heavy with mud, his eyes already narrowed at me. Once I would have lowered my gaze, pressed my lips together and passed quietly. But not that morning. The air around him trembled faintly, just enough for me to notice. His breath hitched, though he didn't know why, and a bead of sweat slid down his temple. I said nothing, just let my eyes meet his until he turned away first. That was when I understood. The power within me was not just mine. It was the echo of every cry that had gone unheard, every lash of the whip that had torn skin, every child ripped from their mother's arms. It was vengeance, patient and steady, waiting for my hand to guide it. The others whispered that grief had broken me. Perhaps it had. But broken things cut sharper. From that day forward, I carried not just my own sorrow, but the sorrow of countless others, the sorrow of centuries. My mother's voice lingered in my ears, not gentle but commanding. My sister's cry burned like iron in my chest. I had nothing left to lose, and that made me dangerous. The breaking point had come, and I would never return to who I was before. The weeks after Mercy's sale and my mother's burial blurred together like a fever dream. Time no longer moved the way it once had. Days stretched slow as molasses, while nights collapsed in on themselves like traps. I drifted through work in the fields and tending to the sick as if in two worlds at once. The world of the living with its sweat and dust and overseer's bark, and the world of spirits where whispers crawled like vines across the back of my mind. At first I thought the voices were only grief. Maybe my mind had split from too much sorrow, and this was madness clinging to me like a shadow. But then I noticed things. Little things at first. A sick child I touched shivered once, then calmed instantly, her fever breaking before my eyes. A woman whose leg had swollen from an infection found her skin cooling, the angry red streaks fading after I whispered words I did not understand. Even animals seemed to pause around me. Dogs lowered their heads, their eyes tracking me with caution. Birds, once so quick to scatter, sat still on branches when I passed, their beady eyes gleaming as though they recognized me. And the Ashfords, they felt it too. Elizabeth Ashford, the mistress of the house, had always carried herself like she walked above the earth rather than on it. Her gowns trailed across Magnolia Ridge's floors with the sound of silk waves, and her voice rang sharp with entitlement. I had attended her through 3 pregnancies before. Each one had ended with a healthy child placed into her waiting arms, while I stood in the background, silent as the wallpaper. But in the weeks after my mother's death and Mercy's disappearance, Elizabeth's eyes lingered on me longer. She would frown when I entered her room, her lips pressing into thin lines, her fingers twitching against the lace of her sleeves. She said nothing, but I could feel it. Her spirit recoiling, her body recognizing what her mind refused to name. By late summer, whispers began to curl through the quarters. They said Elizabeth was with child again. The air thickened with the news. Once that might have filled the house with celebration, but this time was different. The memory of Mercy's screams burned too hot in me, and the power surging in my veins felt restless, begging to be shaped. I told myself I would not act. I told myself I would keep my head down, that I would not let grief twist me into something unrecognizable. But vengeance has its own hunger, and once it wakes, it does not starve quietly. The first dream came to Elizabeth before the pregnancy had even shown on her body. She woke screaming in the night, claiming dark-skinned women with golden eyes had surrounded her bed. She said they spoke in tongues she didn't understand, yet somehow the meaning carved itself into her mind. I was called to soothe her, to lay cool cloths on her forehead and brew teas to calm her nerves. I did so with a steady hand and a quiet smile. But as I smoothed the fabric across her skin, I whispered words beneath my breath, words the spirits had given me in the woods, words that carried the weight of my mother's silence and Mercy's cries. From that night on, the pregnancy grew darker by the day. Elizabeth's sickness was unlike any morning sickness I had ever seen. She vomited until her ribs ached. Her head throbbed with invisible nails pounding inside her skull. At times, she swore she felt something moving in her womb besides the child. Something cold, something watching. The white doctors came, their hands soft from city living, their voices laced with false authority. They could diagnose nothing. They prescribed laudanum, bed rest, bleeding, all the nonsense they always leaned on when faced with a problem their books could not explain. But their medicine failed her. I, however, knew exactly what was happening, because I was the one guiding it. When I placed my hands on her swollen belly, I felt 2 heartbeats, one fragile and faltering, the other strong and steady. Though it did not belong to flesh and blood, it belonged to something deeper, something older. I had invited it. As weeks turned into months, Elizabeth's body swelled unnaturally. She could barely walk, her once proud posture bent by pain. Her eyes hollowed, her skin stretched thin and waxy, and all the while, I tended her like the devoted servant she believed me to be. My smile never faltering, my touch gentle, even as I fed her teas that worsened her weakness, and whispered chants that thickened the air around her with dread. I wanted her to understand. I wanted her to feel. The walls of Magnolia Ridge shuddered with Elizabeth's screams. For 36 hours she labored, her voice ragged, her body torn apart by pain so intense that even the midwives paled. I stood beside her, holding her damp hand, whispering that she was strong, whispering that she would make it through. But the truth was, I had already decided her fate. This was not about her survival. It was about her child's. When the baby finally came, the room went silent. A thin cry, weak and trembling, filled the air. For 13 breaths, that fragile life clung on. 13, a number that would forever ring in my mind like a tolling bell. Then silence. Elizabeth's scream broke the night wide open. It carried out the windows, over the fields, into the slave quarters, into the woods where spirits stirred awake. It was not just grief, it was terror, because in her heart she knew this was no accident. I stood at the doorway, my hands folded before me, my face calm. Inside, something cold and satisfied pulsed through me. This was only the beginning. From that night forward, the Ashfords would carry a curse. They would never again know peace and childbirth. Every pregnancy would be shadowed by spirits who demanded payment. Every child would be weighed against the scales of injustice. And beyond the children, every aspect of their lives would wither. Wealth turning bitter, sleep shattered by dreams of stolen voices, joy hollowed into ash. The seed had been planted. And it would grow, not just through Elizabeth, but through every generation that bore the Ashford name. As the firelight flickered against the walls of my cabin that night, I whispered to the spirits who had come to me in the woods, "It is done." But the truth was, it had only just begun. The curse took root quietly at first, like a sickness that hides beneath the skin before it shows on the surface. Outsiders could not see it yet. To them, Magnolia Ridge still gleamed. A mansion with tall white columns, its cotton fields stretching out like a sea of wealth, its carriages rolling across gravel drives, polished by enslaved hands. But I saw the cracks forming, I heard the whispers, and the spirits, restless and watchful, reminded me each night that the work had only begun. Elizabeth Ashford became a ghost of herself within weeks of losing that first child. She moved through the grand halls of her home in silk gowns that now hung loose on her frame, her once bright emerald eyes dimming to a lifeless shade. She spoke little to anyone, save for the times when she muttered in her sleep. I would pass by her door and hear her crying out names that did not belong to the living. Names of children who had never drawn a breath, names she had never spoken before. Some nights, I heard her humming lullabies to empty cradles, the sound thin and cracked like dry wood snapping in the fire. Other nights, she screamed at shadows only she could see, shouting at invisible figures who crowded her bed, demanding debts she could never repay. Colonel Marcus Ashford, her husband, tried to hold the household together. He was a man built of iron, or so he believed. His voice thundered through the fields. His hands struck quick against backs bent under labor. His wealth and authority placed him among the proudest planters in Mississippi. But no amount of iron can withstand rot once it sets in. It began with the fields. Cotton that once grew thick and plentiful, now sprouted thin, sickly, as though the soil itself recoiled from feeding those who profited off suffering. When harvest came, the bowls were fewer, lighter, almost hollow. Other plantations nearby brought in their usual profits, their wagons overflowing. Magnolia Ridge, however, barely scraped enough to meet its debts. Marcus blamed the enslaved. He accused us of laziness, of sabotage, of failing him on purpose. His punishments grew harsher. But even as the lash cracked louder and blood soaked into the dirt, the crops continued to fail. Then came the livestock. Horses went lame for no reason. Cows stopped producing milk. Chickens laid eggs with shells so thin they collapsed in a farmer's hand. Marcus brought in veterinarians from town, men with spectacles and polished boots, but none could explain it. Strange afflictions, they said, scratching their heads, pocketing his money, leaving without answers. And the accidents, those were worse. Wagons lost wheels on smooth paths. Fences collapsed for no reason. Fire broke out in a storage shed one night without a single lantern left burning nearby. A worker fell from the roof of the cotton gin, his body broken like dry straw. The enslaved whispered among ourselves at night. We knew what this was. The curse had not only entered Elizabeth's womb, it had sunk into the very bones of Magnolia Ridge. By the time the second pregnancy came, the whispers grew louder. Elizabeth carried that child with trembling fear, clutching her belly as though she could shield it from the forces closing in. I pretended to care for her. I brewed teas. I sang soft hymns. I laid my hands on her swollen stomach. But every touch carried intention. Every chant fed the curse's roots. When the second child came, the story repeated. A cry, weak and fleeting. A life that flickered like a candle flame snuffed out by the wind. And once again, Elizabeth's screams cut through the plantation, so sharp and raw that even the overseer's whip hand faltered for days afterward. Marcus's anger boiled over. He stormed through the house, breaking chairs, shattering glasses, his rage a storm that threatened to consume anyone nearby. He blamed Elizabeth for weakness, though he never said it aloud where others could hear. He blamed doctors, midwives, even me, especially me. His eyes narrowed whenever I entered a room, suspicion burning there like hot coals. But he could not accuse me, not openly, because the truth was, he still needed me. His slave still needed healing when fever spread. His wife still needed a hand to hold when shadows crowded her bed. Even he, when plagued by migraines that grew sharper by the month, came to me for tonics and poultices. He drank the bitter teas I offered, without knowing that every sip carried another drop of the curse into his bloodline. By the end of the decade, Magnolia Ridge no longer stood as the shining jewel it once had been. Neighbors whispered about the Ashfords behind closed doors. They still attended social gatherings, still dressed in their finery, but the glow of envy around them had dulled. So much misfortune, some said. Perhaps it's bad soil. Others hinted at darker causes, though few dared to say the words aloud. Elizabeth, once the picture of southern beauty, aged twice as fast as her peers. Her hair grayed before her time, her skin sagged, her eyes hollowed out. She avoided mirrors, avoided sunlight, avoided life itself. Some days she would not leave her room at all. I would find her curled on the floor, clutching a doll that had belonged to her firstborn, rocking back and forth as though she could lull herself into another reality. Marcus, on the other hand, fought harder. He invested in new land, bought shares in the railroads, purchased riverboats to expand his fortune. Yet every gamble soured, a ship sank, a partner died suddenly, a railroad collapsed under faulty construction. It was as if invisible hands plucked each coin from his palm, turning wealth to dust before his very eyes. The enslaved community watched with a mixture of awe and sorrow. Many saw the curse as justice, long overdue. Others feared it would bring only more punishment upon us. But I knew. I felt it in my veins each time I called upon the spirits. This was balance. This was the universe answering wounds that had bled too long. One night, while walking past the slave cemetery, I felt the ground tremble faintly beneath my feet. Not an earthquake, something deeper. A rumbling of voices rising from below. Ancestors gathering, their presence so thick the air seemed to buzz. And I knew then what the Ashfords did not. The curse was no temporary plague. It had been bound into the soil, the blood, the very air of Magnolia. Elizabeth's womb was not the only vessel. The entire plantation had become one. Every death, every sickness, every crop failure fed it, like water to roots, and the roots were spread. When I looked at the mansion from across the fields that night, its white columns gleamed ghostly in the moonlight. But I no longer saw a house of wealth. I saw a tomb being built slowly around its owners, brick by invisible brick. And I knew their story would not end in whispers. It would end in screams. The third pregnancy came in the spring of 1852, when Magnolia Ridge's fields were still struggling to recover from another poor harvest. By then, the curse had already become a shadow no one could ignore. The house servants whispered of strange noises at night. The overseers crossed themselves when accidents struck twice in a week, and even Marcus, proud as he was, began keeping a flask of whiskey near at all times, drinking it down like medicine against unseen forces. Elizabeth carried her swelling belly like a prisoner dragged in chains. Her body sagged under the weight of fear as much as under the child itself. She avoided mirrors, for when she dared to glance at her reflection, she swore she saw not her own face, but the hollowed eyes of a corpse staring back. I was summoned to her bedside more often now, the one presence she allowed near when terror overtook her. She would clutch my wrist with icy hands, begging me to pray with her, begging me to promise this child would live. Her voice trembled with desperation, but beneath her words I heard another rhythm, the steady heartbeat of the curse pulsing through her blood. I told her what she wanted to hear. I held her hand and whispered prayers, the kind she recognized, soft hymns in her tongue. But underneath, my lips shaped the syllables of older languages, ones carved into my bones by ancestors who had endured chains yet carried unbroken power. The night of the birth was like something pulled straight from the pages of a nightmare. A storm rolled in, lightning clawing at the sky, thunder rattling the windows. Elizabeth screamed for hours, her voice rising higher each time, until it seemed even the heavens listened. When at last the child slid into this world, silence followed. Not the sweet silence of peace, but the heavy, smothering kind that presses on the lungs. The midwife froze, the doctor paled. In my arms lay a child twisted and malformed, its tiny chest rising and falling only once, twice, before stilling. Elizabeth's scream was different this time. It was not just grief. It was rage, terror, the sound of a woman realizing her womb had become a graveyard. She struck out at me, clawing, demanding why her prayers had gone unanswered. But even as she cursed me with a voice, her eyes begged me with a silent question she dared not ask. "Did you do this?" I said nothing. I let the silence answer for me. Word spread quickly beyond Magnolia Ridge. Neighbors whispered that something unnatural had settled over the Ashfords. 3 children gone, fields failing, fortune shrinking. To polite society they offered explanations: soil exhaustion, illness, bad luck. But behind fans and in the corners of parlors, people muttered darker suspicions. Still, Marcus refused to bow. His pride was too deeply rooted. He poured more money into railroads, bought more slaves, built more barns. He acted as though sheer force of will could drown out misfortune. Yet every venture soured. A shipment of cotton sank in the river. A contract dissolved when a partner died suddenly. Each loss was another drop of blood drawn by the curse. And Elizabeth, she unraveled piece by piece. The woman who once hosted glittering dinners now wandered the halls barefoot, her hair unkempt, her voice a whisper to children who weren't there. Servants told me they found her in the nursery some nights, cradling air as if rocking an invisible baby. Other times she planned birthdays, setting empty chairs at tables, humming songs no one else could hear. She clung to me more than ever, though part of her recoiled in fear. Her body needed me, her mind doubted me, her spirit recognized me. When I touched her, she stiffened as though I carried frost in my palms. When I prayed aloud, her eyes widened, as though she sensed there were 2 prayers layered within the same breath. One for her, one against her. The price of blood was being collected slowly, deliberately. Each death did not lessen the curse, it fed it. Like a muscle exercised, it grew stronger. The spirits grew hungrier. By 1855, the mansion itself carried the weight. Shadows moved without cause. Cold spots lingered in rooms no matter how many fires were lit. Visitors found themselves ill after leaving, stricken with headaches or fevers that passed as soon as they returned home. Invitations to Magnolia Ridge dwindled. The Ashfords became pariahs wrapped in silks and pearls. Yet Marcus pressed harder, trying to outspend the curse. He borrowed against futures that never arrived. He beat slaves harder, convinced fear would force better yields from cursed soil. But the land no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the debt collectors no banker could name, the ancestors, the spirits, the cosmic law written into creation. The 4th child died before it could take its first breath. Elizabeth lay pale and still afterward, eyes fixed on the ceiling, lips whispering words no one could decipher. I leaned close enough to hear. She was naming them, the children who had never lived, her voice weaving their ghosts into lullabies. It was then I realized something. The curse was not only destroying her body, it was reshaping her soul. She was being hollowed out, turned into a vessel that echoed with absence. And the emptier she became, the more the curse had room to grow. I should have pitied her. Once I might have. But standing over her frail form, hearing the whispers of my ancestors in my ears, I felt only the weight of justice. This was not cruelty, this was balance. She bore the burden of centuries. She was the mirror reflecting back all the stolen lives, all the unborn children denied by chains and lashes. The price of blood was being paid. Still some nights I wondered. I would sit by the fire in my cabin, the orange glow flickering across my hands, and question the path I had chosen. Each life lost in that mansion tore a scream from Elizabeth's throat, but it also carved another scar into me. I could feel it in my chest, a heaviness that was not just vengeance but grief too. Was I becoming something more than human, or less? The spirits did not answer. They only pressed closer, their presence thick in the air, reminding me of the bargain I had sealed. I had asked for justice, and justice had no mercy. The Ashfords' wealth, their name, their lineage, all of it was bleeding out slow and unstoppable. And I was the knife, the unseen hand guiding the flow. One thing was certain, the curse had not reached its full strength yet. The price of blood was only beginning to be collected. The debt was vast, stretching back generations. And every drop of suffering the Ashfords endured was only a down payment. The final reckoning still waited, patient as the grave. By the late summer of 1856, Magnolia Ridge was a house perched on the edge of a cliff, the ground beneath it crumbling little by little with every passing season. No matter how many repairs Marcus ordered, the mansion seemed to sag under an invisible weight. Boards groaned, plaster cracked, and the once proud veranda leaned like a drunkard against the columns. Visitors who came still spoke in polite tones, but their eyes flicked nervously toward shadows, and their carriages rarely lingered past dusk. The curse had ripened. I felt it in the soil when I knelt to plant herbs. Roots squirming like restless snakes, the dirt clinging to my skin as though alive. I felt it in the wind that rattled the shutters even on still nights, carrying whispers that made strong men sweat in their beds. And I felt it most in the air around Elizabeth, heavy as a storm cloud, charged with an electricity that no lightning rod could ground. Her pregnancies no longer lasted long enough for neighbors to hear of them. A few months, sometimes only weeks, before pain struck and the promise of life collapsed into stillness. Each failure left her thinner, more fragile, her beauty drained like water from a cracked vase. But her eyes grew sharper, hollow yet piercing, as if she could see into the shadows that pressed around us all. "Do you hear them too?" she whispered to me once, her hand clutching mine with a desperate strength. The children, their voices never stopped. They said nothing. Silence was the only answer I had. But she was not wrong. The air around Magnolia Ridge swarmed with voices. Babies that had never drawn breath, ancestors demanding balance, spirits crowding the halls like uninvited guests. To me, their presence was a bomb, a reminder of justice unfolding. To Elizabeth, it was a torment, a constant dirge that carved away her sanity piece by piece. Marcus tried to fight shadows with iron and flesh. He hired a priest to bless the house, but the man left pale and trembling, crossing himself as though he'd glimpsed hell itself. He brought a doctor from Charleston, who prescribed tinctures and rest, then fled when Elizabeth screamed at invisible children in the middle of his visit. He even allowed a conjure man, dragged in secret from another plantation, to walk the fields, scattering powders and chanting in a tongue Marcus did not understand. But nothing silenced the storm. For every measure he took, the curse struck hard. Crops blackened in the fields, leaves curling before their time. A prized mare foaled a colt with twisted legs, dead within hours. A new barn, built at great expense, burned to the ground one night, without a spark anyone could find. The overseer who whipped a boy too harshly fell from his horse the next day. His neck snapped clean. The enslaved whispered more openly now. They no longer hid their glances toward me when disaster struck. They did not speak it aloud, but in their eyes I read the truth. They saw me as the hand of vengeance, not merely Celeste the midwife, Celeste the healer. I had become something greater, something darker, and I felt it too. My dreams grew heavy with visions. Fields of blood, rivers rising, fire swallowing the mansion whole. Some nights I woke with my mouth full of dirt, as though I had been burying myself alive in my sleep. My body ached as if carrying the weight of generations. But with the pain came power. The herbs I touched grew richer, stronger. The salves I prepared healed wounds faster than ever before. To my people, I was a source of life. To the Ashfords, I was a shadow tightening around their throat. The storm gathered in me as much as around me. By autumn, whispers reached even beyond Magnolia Ridge. Neighbors spoke of the cursed Ashfords. Some cut ties entirely, fearing contagion of the supernatural sort. Others lingered out of morbid curiosity, attending dinners where Elizabeth stared blankly into her plate, and Marcus drank himself into belligerence, while invisible hands rattled the silverware. One evening, a neighbor's wife fainted when she claimed to see a child crouched beneath the dining table, its eyes black pits staring straight into hers. When the men searched, nothing was found, yet the woman never returned, and word spread faster than wildfire. Magnolia Ridge had become a haunted house, and I was its hidden architect. Still, the curse was not complete. My ancestors whispered of a binding yet unfinished. The Ashfords suffered, yes, but suffering alone was not enough. The wound needed sealing, the balance locked. Without it, the curse might one day wane, its strength diluted across years. I plucked feathers from a crow that had died on the mansion roof, its neck broken by no hand. Piece by piece, I assembled the tools of binding. I crafted a doll from corn husks, stuffing it with graveyard dirt, ash, and strands of Elizabeth's hair stolen from her comb. Into its chest I pressed a shard of bone dug from the slave cemetery, a bone that had lain beneath the soil longer than I had lived. Each night I whispered over it, feeding it breath and blood, tying its fate to the Ashfords and all their descendants. It was no longer a doll. It was a vessel, a mouth through which my ancestors could speak, a spine through which their wrath could crawl. The storm thickened as the equinox drew near. The skies darkened earlier each evening. The winds carried strange scents, iron, smoke, rot. The enslaved began leaving offerings at my cabin door. A scrap of cloth, a piece of bread, a lock of hair. They never spoke as they left them, but their silence was consent. They knew what was coming. Elizabeth, frail and hollow-eyed, seemed to sense it too. One night, as I tended her trembling frame, she whispered, "You've brought them here. You've opened the door?" For the first time, I met her gaze without disguise. I let her see what lived in my eyes, the storm, the spirits, the weight of centuries. She gasped, recoiling, but it was too late. She knew, yes, I had opened the door, and soon I would lock it shut, with her bloodline trapped forever inside. The equinox night fell heavy as iron, darker than any I had ever seen. The air itself seemed to pause, holding its breath in anticipation of what was about to unfold. Clouds smothered the moon, and not a single star pierced the black veil overhead. Magnolia Ridge lay hushed in a silence so deep that even the cicadas stilled their song. The plantation slept uneasily, though none knew why. They tossed and turned in their beds. But I knew I had been preparing for months. Every ingredient, every symbol, every chant had been chosen with care, guided by ancestral whispers that threaded through my dreams. This night, when the boundary between worlds was thinnest, when the scales of light and dark stood balanced for only a heartbeat, I would tilt them. Forever. I carried the corn-husk doll wrapped in red cloth. Its belly swelled with grave dirt, river clay, and the brittle shard of a forgotten bone. Tied around its neck was a string of teeth I had gathered. Small ones from children lost before their first year. Teeth that carried the innocence of lives denied. Their energy hummed through my fingers, a chorus of voices pressing for release. The graveyard waited at the edge of the plantation, cloaked in shadows deeper than the night itself. Unmarked mounds stretched in every direction. The resting places of men and women who had been worked to death, beaten, starved, left nameless in soil that drank their last tears. It was here, among them, that my circle had been drawn, white cornmeal forming lines too old to have been invented by man, dusted with brick and salt to keep out what did not belong. I stepped inside the circle barefoot, the dirt cool and damp beneath my skin. In the center lay the doll, cradled on a patch of cloth taken from Elizabeth's wedding gown. It glowed faintly under the black sky, as if the ancestors themselves were already touching it. I breathed deep and began. The chants rose from me, not as language I had learned, but as memory buried in my bones, syllables shaped in kingdoms long destroyed, yet living still in spirit. The rhythm pulsed like drums, though none beat in the night. My voice wove with unseen voices, 1,000 strong, each ancestor lending strength, grief, fury. The air thickened. The ground trembled, a low hum spread through the cemetery, vibrating in the ribs of the dead, in the marrow of the living. My body swayed as if possessed, movements older than myself, guiding my arms, my hands, my steps. I lit the candles, each flame leaping as though starved for air, casting long shadows that twisted like serpents. I sprinkled the grave dirt in wide circles, each handful carrying the weight of unmarked bones. I poured the river water slowly, watching it seep into the earth, binding life to death, past to present. Then I took the blade. It was small, no longer than my hand, fashioned from iron blackened with age. I drew it across my palm, blood welling hot and red. The drops fell onto the doll, sinking into its husk belly. The moment the blood touched, the air split with a sound like a scream, though no mouth made it. The doll shuddered. Its husks rustled, though no wind blew. From its hollow chest rose a faint light, sickly at first, then growing, pulsing with the rhythm of a heartbeat. The air filled with voices, clearer now, overlapping cries of mothers, children, fathers, all bound together in a single demand. Justice! The word shook the trees, rippled through the soil, burned in my ears. I raised my bloodied hand and pressed it to my chest. By my flesh, by my blood, by the debt unpaid, I bind you, I declared, voice breaking and yet strong. Ashford blood you will not escape. Your wealth will sour, your seed will rot, your name will carry sorrow. What you took will be taken, what you broke will be broken. Until the scales are balanced, your line is bound. The ground heaved, graves split. A wind rose, wild and fierce, whipping my hair, pulling at my clothes, circling within the boundaries of my cornmeal lines. The candles flared so bright they seared my eyes, then blew out all at once, plunging the circle into darkness save for the glow of the doll. It writhed now, swelling, cracking, the husks splitting to reveal shadows wriggling beneath. Faces pressed against its surface, children's, women's, men's, screaming silently, eyes wide and wet. They clawed not to escape but to enter, to sink themselves into the vessel that would carry their wrath. I staggered, the power rushing through me too great for flesh to contain. They poured into me, not just around me. I felt them burn through my veins, scrape along my bones, fill my lungs until every breath was centuries old. I was no longer only Celeste. I was the chorus of the enslaved. I was the wound and the blade. I was healer and I was cursed. The doll cracked open. From within, a flame burst. Not fire as men know it, but a light blacker than shadow, bright as grief. It twisted upward, writhing like a serpent, and shot into the sky. The clouds split open, thunder roaring without lightning, as if the heavens themselves bore witness. In that moment, Magnolia Ridge screamed. Every window shattered. Horses reared in their stalls, foaming and kicking. Elizabeth woke shrieking, clutching her barren womb, while Marcus fell from his chair, clutching his chest, choking as though unseen hands gripped his throat. The curse had locked. I collapsed, my body spent, smoke curling from my skin as though fire had burned me from within. The circle smoldered, the ground scarred, the doll nothing but ash scattered by the rising wind. Silence returned, not peace but silence. The silence after a storm that has leveled the land. I lay there in the dirt, eyes wide to the sky, knowing the truth. There was no turning back. I had become what I was meant to be. The Ashfords were bound, their line shackled by spirits they could neither see nor fight. But I too was bound. The ancestors whispered their thanks, but their voices did not leave me. They filled me, lived in me, making me their vessel. My humanity had been the price, and I had paid it. When I rose at last, the graveyard seemed to bow around me, trees bent low, earth still trembling. I left barefoot, blood dried on my palm, knowing that from this night forward Magnolia Ridge, and the Ashfords who claimed it, would never know rest again. The great ritual was complete, and the storm was only beginning. At first the changes were subtle. A missing tool here, a cracked plough there, a horse that stumbled on even ground and never recovered. Things that might have been brushed aside as accidents, coincidences, misfortunes that any farm might endure in passing. Marcus Ashford told himself as much, puffing his cigar and dismissing the nervous murmurs of his overseers. Yet beneath his stern reassurances, unease coiled. Something was not right at Magnolia Ridge. The land itself seemed to sigh with exhaustion. Fields that once rolled lush and green now grew patchy, soil crumbling dry beneath the sun no matter how much water was poured upon it. Cotton stalks yellowed before their blooms could form, as though poisoned from within. When neighboring plantations harvested bales enough to overflow their wagons, Magnolia Ridge's yields dwindled to pitiful scraps. Marcus cursed the weather, cursed his slaves, cursed his luck, but deep down he knew none of those were to blame. The curse was working. Elizabeth grew pale and hollow. Nights filled with fevered dreams left her trembling in sweat-soaked sheets, gasping for air as though chased by unseen hunters. In her nightmares she heard the wails of children, her children, the ones never born or never survived beyond their first gasps. They called to her with voices sharp as broken glass, accusing, pleading, condemning. She woke screaming, clutched her belly, and cried that her womb burned like it was filled with hot coals. The servants whispered of it in the kitchens, in the cabins, while gathering water at the well. They whispered of the lady of the house, who could no longer bear children, of her madness growing worse with every cycle of the moon. They whispered of Celeste, whose shadow stretched longer now, whose very presence made birds fall silent in the tree. I felt their eyes on me, some filled with fear, others with awe. They sensed what I had done even if they dared not speak it aloud. They knew Magnolia Ridge was unraveling, and they knew I was the thread being pulled. Marcus tried to fight back in the only way he knew, with money and muscle. He bought new seed from Charleston, more expensive and supposedly stronger than any before. Yet when planted in Magnolia's fields, it shriveled just the same, as if the soil itself rejected. He purchased fresh horses, strong beasts from Kentucky, only to see them sicken and stumble within weeks of arrival. His overseer whipped the enslaved harder, driving them to work the cursed land. But no lash could force crops from ground that had been bound against him. By the second year, creditors circled like vultures. Marcus mortgaged portions of his land, vowing to regain what he had lost. Each venture failed in ways that defied reason. A shipment of cotton spoiled on the river despite dry weather. A partner dropped dead of apoplexy days before signing a lucrative contract. A barn fire destroyed half his stored grain, though no spark had been lit nearby. Magnolia Ridge was no longer a jewel. It was a bleeding wound. Elizabeth retreated from society, curtains drawn tight around her chambers. She would not step outside, her skin gone sensitive to light, her mind unraveling in threads too tangled to mend. She sang lullabies to empty cradles, arranged dolls at the dining table, and called them by names that belonged to children who had never lived. On stormy nights, her voice carried through the halls, laughing and sobbing as though speaking with ghosts. Marcus grew harsher, his temper fraying under the weight of misfortune. He whipped men until the blood ran, not for failing him, but because he could not strike at the true enemy. He raged at the sky, cursed his wife, cursed himself. Yet all the while, the curse crept deeper, wrapping around him like ivy climbing stone, slowly breaking it apart. For us, the enslaved, the change was a strange relief, though it carried its own terror. The overseer's lash fell less often, for Marcus had less energy to waste on cruelty when his world crumbled. Food grew scarcer, but the fear that had ruled us lessened, replaced by the quiet knowledge that the Ashfords were trapped in something they could not escape. The ancestors were delivering their justice, and we were living long enough to witness it. At night I walked the cemetery where the ritual had been bound. The air there was alive, shimmering with a power that prickled my skin. I spoke with the spirits, asked them to spare the innocent, to guide our people through the storm without breaking us. Their voices answered sometimes in whispers of wind, sometimes in the flicker of candle flames that bent without cord. They promised the Ashfords would suffer until their debts were paid. By the third year, Magnolia Ridge had become a shadow of itself. Paint peeled from the grand columns, shingles fell from the roof, guests stopped visiting, invitations went unanswered. Where once the Ashfords had hosted grand parties filled with music and laughter, now silence ruled the halls. Even the minister came no more, his last sermon having ended with half the congregation falling ill for no clear reason. Elizabeth rarely left her chamber. When she did, she drifted through the halls in nightclothes, her hair thin and grey though she was barely 30. Her eyes looked not at the living but at something distant, invisible, haunting. The servants crossed themselves when she passed, muttering that she was more ghost than woman. Marcus drank deep from his decanters, his hands trembling as he scribbled numbers late into the night, chasing profits that no longer existed. He had once been a man of iron, proud and certain. But now his shoulders slumped, his face sagged, his voice broke when he thought no one was listening. He was fighting an enemy he could not see, could not strike, and he was losing. The collapse was not sudden. It was slow, cruel, deliberate, each year stripping more from them until there was nothing left but bone. The curse worked patiently, methodically, as if savoring each bite of the family's ruin. And I watched. I healed the ones who needed healing among my people. I comforted the children, telling them stories of ancestors who fought not with whips and chains but with spirit and song. And I carried the weight of what I had done, knowing it was not over yet, that the Ashfords' punishment had only begun. Magnolia Ridge was dying, and with each day that passed, I could feel the ancestors pressing closer, their whispers louder, urging me onward. The collapse was not an ending, it was a beginning. It began with whispers. At first Elizabeth thought them nothing more than tricks of sleepless nights, the echo of wind against the shutters or servants talking in distant rooms. But the whispers grew sharper, closer, until they wrapped around her like silk cords that would not break. They called her name, sometimes gently, like children reaching for their mother, and sometimes like an accusation, a hissed reminder of sins buried deep beneath the soil of Magnolia Ridge. She covered her ears, pressed pillows tight against her head, but the voices seeped through, vibrating inside her bones. "You owe us," they said. "You owe in blood." Her dreams turned against her. She saw children with eyes too large for their faces, their limbs thin and twisted, standing at the foot of her bed. She would wake with her sheets wet, unsure whether from sweat, tears, or blood that wasn't her own. At dawn, the nursery, once filled with sunlight and laughter she had imagined for her children, became a place of dread. Rocking chairs moved on their own. Cradles swayed though no wind touched them. Lullabies hummed softly though no voice sang. Each month brought new pregnancy, and each month brought loss. The pain was not only in her womb, but in her mind, in her heart. She clutched her belly as life slipped away inside her, whispering promises to babies who would never see the world. The blood came heavier each time, soaking the sheets, staining her hands. The physician shook his head in silence. The midwife crossed herself, muttering of curses no prayer could lift. Elizabeth's beauty withered as though the curse drained it from her piece by piece. Her once gleaming hair fell in brittle clumps. Her skin lost its luster, turning pale and waxy, stretched tight over sharp bones. Her emerald eyes, once the envy of every woman in town, dulled until they reflected only madness. When she caught her reflection in the mirror, she recoiled, convinced another woman stared back at her. An older, crueler version who smirked at her suffering. The mansion's servants whispered of her decline. They carried trays of food to her chamber, only to find the dishes untouched, left to rot as if she could not bear the taste of sustenance. Sometimes they heard her speaking softly to the empty air, calling names that belonged to no living child. At night, the corridors echoed with her laughter high and broken, or with screams that froze even the bravest hearts. Marcus grew embarrassed, furious, and then distant. He locked her in her rooms for days at a time, ordering the servants to keep her hidden from visitors who might spread rumors of madness. But he could not lock away the sounds. Her cries seeped through the walls, her wails haunting the very bones of Magnolia Ridge. I often heard her when I walked the grounds at night. Her voice floated through the windows, sometimes pleading, sometimes raging, sometimes singing lullabies so sweet they curdled into sorrow. My people whispered of her too, of the lady who had mocked their pain now drowning in her own. Some pitied her. Others said justice was finally being served. I remained silent, though in my heart I knew this was the curse doing its work. Elizabeth's torment deepened in ways no human physician could measure. She began to see shadows where none should be, shapes moving across her walls, faces forming in the corners of her vision. She claimed the house was full of children, her children, laughing, crying, calling for her. She set extra plates at the table, arranged toys on the nursery floor, wrote letters to relatives describing the milestones of children who had never lived beyond their first breath. Her letters grew more disturbing as the years passed. She described a boy with hair the color of wheat who had learned to walk at 9 months, though no such boy had ever existed. A girl with green eyes who sang songs in a language Elizabeth swore she never taught her. When family in Charleston wrote back in confusion, Marcus burned the letters before anyone else could read them. But the servants already knew. Their mistress lived more among ghosts than among the living. Elizabeth's torment became Magnolia Ridge's torment. Her mood shook the household like storms. One moment she was tender, stroking the cheek of a servant child, as though it were her own. The next, she was violent, screaming, clawing, demanding to know who had stolen her baby. She scratched at the walls until her fingernails bled, shrieked at mirrors until Marcus ordered them all covered with sheets. At times she turned her fury inward. Servants found her collapsed on the floor, wrists bloodied, eyes vacant. The physician warned Marcus she might not last another year, but somehow she did, clinging to life with the desperation of a woman who refused to surrender even as her sanity slipped away. The curse was patient, merciless. It did not grant her release. There were nights when I felt her pain echo through the land, as if Magnolia Ridge itself carried her screams in its soil. I stood at the cemetery listening, and though I knew her torment was deserved, I also felt the weight of what it meant. The curse did not simply punish, it devoured. It made an example of her, so that all who witnessed would know what injustice demanded in return. By the end of the decade, Elizabeth was unrecognizable. No longer a matron of wealth and beauty, she was a shadow of a woman, hollow-eyed, hair thin and gray, body hunched and frail. Yet she endured, year after year, each day dragging her deeper into madness. She became the living embodiment of Magnolia Ridge's decay. Her very presence a reminder that wealth and power meant nothing when the ancestors demanded justice. The servants avoided her chambers when they could, but at night, her voice still filled the halls, sometimes singing, sometimes weeping, always lingering, as though Magnolia Ridge itself had become her prison as much as her home. The torment would not end. Not for her, not for Marcus, not for any Ashford to come. And I walked among the ruins of what they once were, carrying the knowledge that the curse was not yet finished. Elizabeth's madness was only one note in a song that would echo across generations. The scales were still being balanced. I used to watch Marcus from the shadows of the fields, from the gardens where herbs grew thick and green, from the edge of the cemetery where the air was always colder. He walked the land like a man pursued, shoulders bent, eyes hollow, steps uncertain. Once he had strutted through Magnolia Ridge like a king, his voice booming with commands, his hand quick to strike. Now he muttered to himself, hands trembling, eyes darting as though he saw enemies no one else could see. The curse was eating him alive. At first, Marcus fought it with arrogance. He brought in physicians from Charleston, men who carried books thick as bricks, and spoke in confident tones. They pressed stethoscopes to his chest, asked questions he could not answer, and left with their fees paid in gold but no remedy. He summoned ministers who sprinkled holy water in every room, chanting psalms until their throats grew raw. He even hired men who claimed knowledge of ancient secrets, strangers from faraway ports with talismans and powder. But no matter how many prayers, remedies, or rituals, the shadows followed him. He stopped sleeping. Candles burned through the night in his study, flames flickering against ledgers he could no longer comprehend. His handwriting grew jagged, his numbers wrong, his accounts bleeding red ink. Railroads he invested in collapsed before a single mile was laid. Ships he financed never reached their ports. Partners withdrew in disgust or fear, leaving him adrift in debts that swallowed even Magnolia Ridge's once immense fortune. At night he heard the same whispers that plagued Elizabeth, Though where hers were tender, coaxing, his were sharp, accusatory. Thief, they called him. Murderer, master of nothing. You built your kingdom on broken backs, and now the ground shifts beneath your feet. I knew the voice. They were the same cries I had heard in the woods, in my dreams, in the ancestral chants that filled my blood the night I sealed the curse. The ancestors were not finished with him. They wanted more than suffering. They wanted his soul stripped bare, forced to confront every cruelty he had ever inflicted. Marcus fought the curse as he had fought everything in his life, with violence. He smashed mirrors when faces appeared behind his reflection, bloodied his fists against walls when shadows reached for him. He struck the servants harder than ever, accusing them of conspiring against him, of poisoning his food, of spying in the night. Some fled the estate, disappearing into the woods, risking punishment or death rather than endure his madness. Those who remained whispered that their master had lost, not just his wealth but his reason. There were moments when I glimpsed him through the windows, hunched at his desk, writing letters he never sent. Sometimes he tore them apart, sometimes he burned them, but once a fragment drifted into the garden where I walked. I picked it up. The words were shaky, scrawled with desperation. The children's eyes haunt me. They are not mine, yet they know me. God help me, they know me. He could not escape them. The unborn children of Elizabeth, the enslaved children who had died nameless, all pressed against him like an ocean he could not hold back. His mind fractured beneath the weight. Still, Marcus clung to the shell of control. He ordered more slaves purchased, as though expanding his dominion could restore his crumbling power. But each wagon that arrived brought only more mouths to feed, more eyes that watched him with quiet hatred, more hearts that whispered prayers he could not silence. Crops rotted in the fields, tools broke in men's hands, storms swept through at the worst possible moments. Magnolia Ridge yielded less with every season, and Marcus's fury grew like a storm no wall could contain. I remember the night he stood on the veranda shouting into the darkness. Rain soaked him to the bone, thunder cracked the sky, but he raged as though the heavens themselves were his enemies. I am Marcus Ashford, he bellowed. This land is mine, mine by blood, mine by law, mine by light. Do you hear me? The wind answered with a howl that bent the trees. The rain lashed harder, and a bolt of lightning struck the fields, setting dry stalks ablaze. Marcus staggered back, his defiance broken, his scream drowned by the storm. After that night, something in him snapped. He no longer strode the halls with authority. He shuffled, muttering, clutching a flask that never left his hand. His beard grew wild, his clothes stained and wrinkled. He spoke less of profits, more of debts, less of dominance, more of omens. He became a man hollowed out, sustained only by anger and fear. Elizabeth's torment and his own madness created a silence in the house that was worse than any noise. Servants tiptoed through corridors, praying not to draw his attention. I too walked with caution, though I carried no fear. I knew the curse would have its way with him, and no whip or gun could save him from what had already begun. In the final years of his life, Marcus avoided mirrors entirely. He said they showed him not his own reflection, but the faces of the people he had chained, whipped, sold. Faces twisted with pain, eyes full of vengeance. He smashed every piece of glass in Magnolia Ridge, but even water in the basin rippled with shadows that did not belong. He wasted away thinner each month, his once powerful frame collapsing in on itself. He drank more, slept less, muttered prayers that dissolved into curses. The curse had broken him, and still it would not release him. The night he died, the sky was clear. No storms, no thunder, only the servants found him in his study, slumped over the desk, eyes open wide in terror, mouth frozen in a scream that had never found sound. His heart had failed, they said, though I knew better. It was not failure. It was the ancestors calling his name, dragging him into the judgment he could no longer escape. I stood in the cemetery that night, the air still, the stars sharp as knives overhead. The land sighed with relief. One piece of the curse had been fulfilled, but the work was not yet done. For Marcus's death did not free Magnolia Ridge. It bound it tighter to the vengeance that pulsed through its soil, and I knew the curse had only begun to spread. When Marcus Ashford's heart finally gave out, the curse did not end. Death was never release, only a doorway. The man had gone to answer for his deeds in realms where no plantation wealth could bribe, no family name could shield him. But those he left behind, his children, fragile heirs of his corrupted bloodline, were left to carry the weight of sins they never confessed and debts they never chose. I had expected this, of course. The curse was never meant for Marcus. It was crafted to burrow into the veins of the Ashfords, to cling to them like smoke, to follow them wherever they fled. and so it did. Marcus had left behind 4 surviving children, James, Catherine, Robert, and little Annabelle. Each bore the Ashford name like a crown in society's eyes, but like a chain in mine. They were young still when their father died, but the shadows did not wait for them to grow old before they began their work. James, the eldest son, inherited Magnolia Ridge and the debts that had been strangling it. He was a man desperate to prove himself, desperate to restore the family's former glory. But every venture he attempted fell apart. The soil refused his seed, the accounts bled money. Partners who once respected the Ashford name now mocked it behind closed doors. At night, James's sleep was broken by screams only he could hear. Children's voices, thin and piercing, calling his name from the darkness outside his window. He tried to drown them with whiskey, but the more he drank, the louder they grew. I heard him wandering the halls one night, muttering, "I didn't do it. I wasn't the one." But the curse did not care for innocence. It punished the bloodline, not the individual. Catherine, the eldest daughter, married into another wealthy family, hoping to escape the decay of Magnolia Ridge. She wore jewels, hosted banquets, and smiled in drawing rooms. But even in her husband's grand estate, the shadows followed her. Guests whispered of how pale she looked, how thin she grew. They said she often paused in the middle of conversation, staring at corners of the room as though someone stood there watching her. Once, during a dinner party, she screamed suddenly and collapsed to the floor, insisting a pair of hands had wrapped around her throat, though none could see them. The physicians called it hysteria. I called it justice. Robert, the second son, fled Mississippi altogether. He moved north, where the soil was cooler and the talk of slavery less comfortable. He built a business in shipping, hoping distance could free him, but curses know no borders. Ships he financed vanished without trace. Crews mutinied, captains drowned. At night, Robert dreamed of salt water rising in his lungs, of chains dragging him into the ocean's depths. He awoke gasping, clawing at his chest, unable to breathe. The curse had found him across miles, across waters. There was no running from what had been written into his blood. And then there was Annabelle, the youngest, barely 12 when her father died. Sweet-faced, quiet, always clinging to her mother's skirt. She grew up in a house that whispered with ghosts, where laughter never lasted, where every shadow seemed to move. By 16, she spoke rarely, and when she did, her words frightened those around her. She said she could see the children Marcus had sold, see them standing in the corners of her room. And fragility is no protection from justice. The Ashford children carried their inheritance like poison in their veins. Society still welcomed them, still bowed to the name. But behind the curtains, behind the polished doors, they trembled. They aged too quickly. They broke too easily. Every dream curdled into a nightmare. Every plan collapsed under invisible weight. They were chased not by men, not by laws, but by memories that did not belong to them, by spirits who had marked their blood as guilty long before they were born. And I felt no pity. Their suffering was proof that the curse lived, proof that justice stretched beyond Marcus's grave. Yet in quiet moments, I wondered what it meant to damn children for the sins of their father. Was this truly justice? Or had I unleashed something deeper, something colder that cared nothing for innocence, only for balance? But the ancestors did not question. They pressed on, relentless. They whispered through Catherine's broken laughter, through James's drunken rage, through Robert's drowning dreams, through Annabelle's hollow eyes. They whispered, "The debt is not paid. The scales are not balanced. Continue." And so the curse continued, weaving its threads tighter around the Ashford bloodline. The children of Marcus grew into adults marked by tragedy. James lost his fortune, Catherine her mind, Robert his life at sea, Annabelle her spirit before she had even lived. Yet even their ruin was not the end. For each bore children of their own, new branches of the bloodline, new vessels for the curse to haunt. It was never meant to stop with them. The Ashfords had passed cruelty down through generations, and so cruelty returned to them in kind. Not in whips, not in chains, but in shadows, in dreams, in the kind of grief that gnawed at the soul and left nothing behind but ash. I walked among them still, healer to the world, but justice to the Ashfords. They could not see the hand guiding their ruin, but I knew. And I knew, too, that I had become something more than Celeste the woman. I was now the keeper of the curse, the vessel of ancestral vengeance, the shadow that would follow the Ashfords until the very last of their line fell silent. The children carried their father's sins, and their children after them. The curse had become blood-deep, bone-deep, written into their very being, and it would not end, not yet. The curse had never been meant to stay chained to the boundaries of Magnolia Ridge. I had anchored it there, yes, fed it with the blood-soaked soil, the enslaved cemetery, the cries of children ripped from their mother's arms. But curses once alive are not obedient things. They grow, they search, they hunger. They follow the blood, and the Ashford blood had never been content to remain in one place. By the time the Civil War tore through Mississippi, the Ashfords were scattered. Cousins from Alabama, uncles from Louisiana, daughters married into families in Georgia and Virginia. Wherever the Ashford name or blood went, the curse reached out, unseen, unrelenting. It began subtly, the way storms begin with whispers of wind. A cousin in Alabama invested in cotton gins that inexplicably broke, their gears grinding themselves into useless fragments within weeks of purchase. A wealthy uncle in Louisiana watched his sugarcane fields blacken overnight, as if fire had kissed the stalks, though no flame had ever touched them. A daughter married into a Richmond family died suddenly in childbirth, her infant gasping only long enough to draw the same 13 breaths that had marked Elizabeth's first cursed child. No one spoke openly of it. In polite circles, such misfortunes were explained away. Mechanical flaws, bad weather, fevers, fragile constitutions. But in the kitchens, in the slave quarters, in the whispered prayers of black women who had seen enough to know better, a different truth was spoken. The Ashfords are marked, they said. Wherever they go, the dead follow. I had not willed this spread directly. It happened naturally, the way a river flows downhill or roots grow deeper into soil. Once set in motion, justice is not something that can be contained by human intention. It follows law older than stars, law written into the bones of creation itself. Every action ripples, every cruelty demands an echo. Still, I felt the widening of its reach. I felt the curse tug at me when new branches of the family fell. At night, I dreamed their deaths. Faces I'd never seen screaming in the dark. Hands reaching toward me as if I were judge and jury both. I would wake drenched in sweat, my heart pounding, the spirits of the enslaved pressing close, whispering, "Balance is being restored." The spread was not limited to blood. The land itself bore memory, and Magnolia Ridge was poisoned in ways no plow or prayer could heal. When distant relatives inherited it, eager to profit from what Marcus had lost, they brought their own workers, their own enslaved people. But the soil rejected them just as it had rejected the Ashfords. Cotton sprouted thin and brittle. Livestock miscarried. Wells turned brackish. Their profits withered, their spirits broke. Neighbors watched from a distance. They whispered of bad luck, of haunted ground. Preachers wagged fingers at sin, though none dared name the sin. Planters shook their heads, muttering about unnatural forces, then turned their eyes away, terrified of being dragged into the same fate. And yet the curse reached farther still. Business partners in New Orleans who had traded with the Ashfords found their ledgers bleeding red. Bankers in Charleston who had extended loans to the family went bankrupt when ships carrying their investments sank in calm seas. Every connection, every contract, every shared coin carried a trace of the Ashford spiritual debt, and debt collects interest, no matter who holds the purse. Some of the enslaved people noticed this too. Those who had once trembled at the Ashford name began to smile in secret, recognizing that justice had grown wings. They told stories of me, of Celeste, the woman who had bound the family to their own cruelty. Around fires at night, they whispered my name like a prayer and a warning both. To them, I was proof that the world was not blind, that no chain was unbreakable, that even the most powerful families could be brought to their knees by forces they could never command. But to the Ashfords, I became myth and nightmare. Letters passed between surviving relatives carried words that quivered with fear. The bad fortune follows us. Our children are not right. I see shadows where none should be. God help us, it feels as if the sins of our fathers are clawing at us. One cousin, desperate, sought out a root worker of his own. He traveled miles to find a woman in Georgia who was said to break curses. She tried. For weeks, she burned herbs, sang prayers, washed him with bitter water. But when he left her cabin, a tree branch snapped loose from a still sky and crushed him before he reached the road. The woman who had tried to help later told others, "It was bigger than me, bigger than any of us." That curse was made with the bones of the earth itself. The Civil War raged, and as the Confederacy crumbled, so did every Ashford scattered across the South. Their wealth drained, their children sickened, their names soured on the tongues of neighbors. Even those who fought in the war seemed marked. One after another, Ashford's sons never returned. Cut down not just by bullets but by fever, by accident, by strange and sudden madness. I had woven a curse to last generations, but already it was clear. It had grown into something larger than even I imagined. What I had set in motion was no longer mine to control. It belonged to the balance now. It belonged to the ancestors, to the spirits of the enslaved, who demanded more than just vengeance against one family. They demanded a lesson, a story carved into history itself, that no wealth built on chains could endure, that no bloodline born from cruelty could escape the harvest of what it had sown. At times I wondered if the curse would end with the Ashfords at all, or would it reach outward forever, staining anyone who profited from bondage, touching every name, every ledger, every hand that had tightened a chain or swung a whip. I did not know, but I could feel it, spreading like fire in dry grass, creeping along the South's veins. And I understood then. I was no longer just the healer of Magnolia Ridge. I was the keeper of a storm that had begun to sweep across the land. The Ashfords had been the first, but they would not be the last. The Ashfords were not the only ones unraveling. By the early 1860s, the entire South trembled beneath the weight of debts no mortal bank could calculate. The Civil War was not born from my curse, but I could feel the resonance between them, the way ancestral justice was no longer limited to a single family, but was beginning to sweep across a nation built on human bondage. The war drums sounded like echoes of the church bell that had struck when I first cast my working. I remembered that night vividly, the toll of midnight, the pull of spirits, the binding of blood. Now on every battlefield I heard the same vibration. Cannons fired, but to me they rang like cosmic gongs, each blast marking another step toward balance. The curse I had unleashed upon the Ashfords was merely a reflection of a larger curse America had brought upon itself. Magnolia Ridge was a ruin by then. Weeds strangled the fields, shutters rattled loose in the wind, and the grand house stood like a hollowed carcass. Yet even in decay, the plantation breathed with restless energy. Soldiers from both armies who passed through spoke of strange noises at night, wails rising from the cemetery, lights flickering in the windows though the house was abandoned. Some said they saw a woman in white walking the veranda, her eyes glowing faintly, her presence so heavy it silenced even the most reckless men. They did not know it was me, nor that what they saw was less flesh than force, a living tether to powers older than their war. Meanwhile, in Richmond, in Atlanta, in Charleston, Ashford bloodlines still struggled, but now their ruin blended with the ruin of the Confederacy itself. Cousins who had once boasted of honor and glory fell in battle before they could fire a second shot. Daughters widowed before they had borne a child. Sons who returned came back broken, not only by wounds but by visions. Phantoms stalking their steps, whispering of chains and whips and debts unpaid. The nation was breaking. Farms lay fallow, cities burned, railroads twisted like melted bones, setted like melted bone. But what struck me most was how closely it mirrored the unraveling of one family. America was experiencing its own Ashford curse. What I had set upon Magnolia Ridge was now being reflected in blood and iron across the land. Wealth turning to ash, children lost, voices of the enslaved rising through smoke to demand their due. I stood among the enslaved when Union soldiers first marched into Mississippi. I saw the disbelief in their eyes, the sudden loosening of chains that had been their reality since birth. Some wept, some laughed, some simply stood silent, unable to imagine a world without the crack of the whip. But I felt something deeper, the ancestors stirring, the scales shifting. This was no accident of politics, no mere clash of armies. This was justice, carried out by human hands but fueled by cosmic inevitability. And yet freedom did not arrive clean. It never does. Many of the enslaved were left with nothing but their broken bodies and empty futures. Sharecropping replaced chains with debts. Racism wore new uniforms, new laws. Justice, it seemed, was never finished, always demanding more. Still, the curse had made its point. Bondage would not last forever. Every empire built on it would fall. The Ashfords who remained alive could not escape witnessing this collapse. Letters from surviving branches told of despair. One cousin wrote from Georgia, "It is as though the war itself was aimed at us. Every fortune I build crumbles. Every son I raise is taken." Another, from Virginia, confessed, "The name Ashford brings no respect now. Only whispers, only pity. We are a dying line." I would sit beneath the magnolia trees and read the echoes of those words in the air. The ancestors hummed around me, satisfied but never silent. Balance is being restored, they told me. But the debt is larger than one family, larger than one war. At times I questioned my role in it all. Had I merely been a spark in a fire that was destined to burn anyway? Or had my curse woven threads into the larger tapestry, pushing history toward its reckoning? Perhaps both were true. Perhaps justice, once awakened, uses every hand available, be it soldier, spirit, or woman with herbs and chants whispered at midnight. The Civil War raged for 4 long years, but to me it felt like a single drawn-out ritual, Every battlefield was an altar, every death was an offering, every cry was a chant rising into the heavens. And with each passing month, I felt the curse within me both tighten and expand, wrapping itself around not just the Ashfords but the entire South, forcing recognition of the truth that had always been buried. A nation cannot prosper when its wealth is built on stolen lives. When Union victory finally came, and the Emancipation Proclamation was more than paper, I felt the ground tremble beneath my feet. It was not just political, it was spiritual. The ancestors had been heard. The scales tipped, though imperfectly, yet even in victory I knew the curse had not ended. The Ashfords still lived, scattered and diminished, but not erased. And the nation, though freed of slavery, carried scars that would not heal quickly. Prejudice, hatred, violence, they lingered like embers waiting for breath to flare again. Justice had been served in part, but the balance demanded constant vigilance. I looked at the children born free, running barefoot across fields that had once soaked up their parents' blood. Their laughter was wild, unshackled. But I also saw the eyes of former masters watching them with quiet resentment, already plotting new ways to bind them, if not with chains, then with laws, with fear, with lies. The ancestors pressed against me then, their voices insistent. The work is not done, the curse remains, justice continues. And I understood. My curse against the Ashfords had grown into something larger. It was no longer mine to direct, no longer mine to end. It had become part of the rhythm of history, part of the tide that would rise again and again until the world truly learned that oppression carries a price no generation can escape. The Ashfords were dying, yes, but America itself had inherited a curse now, one born from centuries of bondage, and I, unwilling or not, had become its witness. After the war, silence settled over Magnolia Ridge like an uneasy truce. The cannons no longer roared, the fields no longer trembled with marching boots, and the skies were no longer blackened with smoke. Yet the air remained heavy, as if the land itself remembered every scream, every lash, every drop of blood spilled across its soil. I walked those fields as a free woman, though I had never known shackles myself. My chains had always been invisible, woven from fear, secrecy, and the burden of carrying a curse that could not be undone. Now I felt a strange mixture of relief and sorrow. Freedom had come for many, but justice is never complete. It arrives in fragments, leaving behind jagged edges. The Ashford name had dwindled to whispers. The once mighty family, who had believed their wealth untouchable and their power divine, had scattered like dry leaves. Those who survived lived small, bitter lives, haunted by dreams of chains and burning houses. Some drank themselves to ruin. Others fled across the sea, trying to outpace their own shadows. But curses travel faster than ships, and whispers of misfortune clung to them wherever they went. I might have left Magnolia Ridge myself, but the land would not let me go. The spirits tethered me to the soil, to the graves of the enslaved, to the magnolia trees that swayed like watchful sentinels. My work was not finished, they told me. Though the war had ended, though slavery had fallen, the balance still required tending. Justice does not rest in a single generation. It must be fed, remembered, carried forward. So I began to tell the story. Not to the victors, not to the white men who penned laws and rewrote history, but to the children of the freed. Around fires at night, in kitchens thick with the smell of cornbread and stew, in quiet fields beneath the stars, I spoke of what had been done to us and what had been demanded in return. I told them of Isaac, whose courage lit the first spark of resistance. I told them of Mary, whose cry in the whipping yard carried across the fields and into the heavens. I told them of the curse. The night the bell rang, the ancestors stirred and the Ashfords began to fall. The children listened with wide eyes, sometimes afraid, sometimes triumphant, always hungry for truth, and I saw in them the seed of something greater than revenge. My story was not just a warning, it was a legacy, a reminder that justice, though slow, could be called forth. A reminder that power was not permanent, that even the mighty could crumble when their foundations were built on cruelty. As years passed, my name became less a person and more a presence. Some called me a conjure woman. Some said I was a ghost who never aged, who walked between this world and the next. Others whispered that I was the ancestor of every child who rose against injustice. I did not correct them. Legends are stronger than flesh, and if my name became a vessel for courage, then so be it. The Ashford mansion finally collapsed in a storm. Its roof caved, its walls split, and within weeks it was a heap of rotting timber. Vines climbed its bones, owls nested in its rafters, and the land reclaimed what had been stolen from it. Yet the cemetery remained untouched. the gravestones of the enslaved standing firm while marble monuments of the masters crumbled to dust. Even in ruin, the balance spoke clearly. I would sit there sometimes among the gravestones, listening to the hum of spirits. They told me stories I did not know. Stories of Africa, of ships, of rebellions silenced and songs remembered. And I in turn carried those stories into the world, weaving them with my own until no one could tell where my tale ended and theirs began. That was how legacy worked. Not as one voice, but as a chorus, rising louder with every generation. Children grew into adults, and adults grew into elders, passing down the tale. They did not always speak my name, but they carried my lessons. Do not let cruelty go unanswered, they said. Do not forget the voices of the dead. And though new struggles came, poverty, laws, violence, the memory of Magnolia Ridge of the Ashford's fall became a touchstone of strength. Sometimes, strangers came seeking me. Freedmen who wanted blessings, mothers who wanted protection for their children, soldiers who carried nightmares home from battle. They came with questions, with offerings, with hope. I gave them herbs, chants, advice, but more than that, I gave them stories. Stories remind people they are not alone. Stories keep the past alive so that mistakes are not repeated. And so I learned that the true power of my curse was not in the Ashford's suffering, but in the survival of my people. The curse ensured the guilty paid their price, yes, but the legacy ensured the innocent remembered their worth. Revenge dies when the last enemy falls. Legacy endures in every heart that beats with defiance. I aged, though slower than most. My hair turned silver, my hands lined with time. Still, people said I did not change. They said I was timeless, a figure who walked through centuries. Perhaps they were right, or perhaps they only saw the spirit within me, the ancestors who refused to let me fade. By the time my own life drew near its end, I no longer feared what would come next. I had lived not just for myself, but for generations yet unborn. My body would rest, but my story would not. The ancestors had made sure of that. And somewhere in the rustling of magnolia leaves, in the crackle of firelight, in the whisper of a mother to a child at bedtime, my voice would rise again. That was my true gift, not the curse, not the fear I brought to the Ashfords, but the knowledge I left behind. Knowledge that chains can break, that masters can fall, and that the dead are never silent. The curse had begun as an act of rage, a plea for balance. It became a bridge between past and future, and in that bridge I found peace. I was no longer just Celeste, the conjure woman of Magnolia Ridge. I was a legacy, a story carried on the tongues of the free, and as long as the story lived, so did I. Legends never end where the storyteller stops. They live on, carried like embers, waiting for the next breath to ignite them again. Long after my body returned to the earth, the story of Magnolia Ridge spread across the south, whispered in the hush of midnight, spoken boldly in churches, woven into songs sung in fields and kitchens. And always, at the center, was the curse, the Ashford's reckoning, my act of balance, the lesson that justice cannot be buried. But curses are not chains that bind only one family. They are ripples across water, stretching farther than the eye can see. The Ashfords were the first to fall, but their story became a mirror for countless others who built their fortunes on stolen lives. The curse, unfinished, reached beyond the plantation, beyond the war, beyond even my name. Some said my spirit lingered in the magnolia trees, watching. Others swore they saw me in dreams, warning them of dangers yet to come. Freed children who had once listened at my knee grew old and told their grandchildren, "She is still with us." When injustice rises, so will her voice. And indeed, injustice did rise again. The war had ended slavery, but not hatred. New laws, cruel in different disguises, took root. Night riders with white hoods stalked the roads, spreading fear like disease. Sharecropping bound men and women to poverty as tightly as chains once had. The promise of freedom flickered, fragile in the wind. It was then that people said the curse shifted. No longer focused only on the Ashfords, it began to stir whenever cruelty tried to wear a crown again. Families who carried whips in secret barns, men who trafficked in stolen labor even after the war, they too began to whisper of misfortunes, of strange deaths, of shadows at their doors. Whether it was my doing or the ancestors' hand, I cannot say. But justice is patient, and it is tireless. Stories of the Ashfords became a kind of warning, a tale parents told their children not for fear but for strength. Remember Magnolia Ridge, they would say. Remember what happens when cruelty thinks itself untouchable. My curse had become more than revenge, it had become prophecy. As the decades turned, the mansion's ruins finally disappeared beneath the earth. Nature buried the scars of Magnolia Ridge, but memory would not allow forgetting. Sometimes travelers stumbled across the cemetery, startled to find neat rows of stones standing while all else had crumbled. They said the air was heavy there, as though hundreds of voices hummed just beyond hearing. Some turned and fled. Others dropped to their knees in awe. The land itself carried the weight of justice. I had thought once that the curse was mine to hold, mine to direct, mine to end, but I was wrong. A curse tied to the blood of the enslaved does not belong to one person. It belongs to the countless souls who endured, who resisted, who demanded to be remembered. I was their vessel, their mouthpiece, their servant. In death I returned to them fully, and together we carried the work forward. Sometimes, in the long years that followed, my spirit drifted to places far beyond Mississippi. I saw trains rumble north, carrying families seeking new beginnings. I saw schools built in dusty towns, blackboards filled with the letters of children once forbidden to read. I saw protests rise in streets, songs shouted in defiance, fists raised against injustice, and always in those moments I felt the curse hum like a heartbeat. Not finished, never finished. Always watching, always waiting. Even in the 20th century, when new masters wore badges instead of whips, I walked unseen beside those who resisted, always unfinished. Perhaps that is the truest legacy of what I did on that night long ago. Not the destruction of one family, but the reminder that history itself demands reckoning. Every injustice leaves a mark. Every cruelty plants a seed that will one day bear bitter fruit. The Ashfords fell because they believed themselves untouchable. So too would others fall who carried the same arrogance. And yet it was not only a curse, it was also a promise. For the descendants of the enslaved, the story carried hope, that their suffering was not invisible, that their ancestors had risen to demand balance, that the world itself would bend toward justice, even if it took centuries. A curse to some, a torch to others, the duality was its power. I do not know how long my story will be told. Perhaps it will fade, buried under new wars, new struggles, new names. But I suspect it will live longer than I ever did. For every time a child asks, "Why did the masters fall?" the answer will rise again, because the dead demanded it. Because the oppressed rose through the voice of one woman who dared to speak for them. Because injustice can never escape the weight of its own crimes. And if someday the world forgets, if it dares to repeat the sins of Magnolia Ridge, then perhaps the curse will rise again in flesh, in spirit, in storm. Perhaps another will take my place. Speak the words, summon the ancestors. The balance must always return, for that is the nature of curses. They are never truly finished. They live in the soil, in the air, in the blood of those who remember. They wait, they linger, they endure, and so does my voice.